What's up, Guardians? Long time no see. I got a really serious question for you today. Are glaives good yet? Ever since their introduction in The Witch Queen, glaives have had a very difficult time adapting to the meta. The exotic glaives have seen their uses, Excalibur and Winterbite most of all, but glaives in general have really only had competent melee builds in the past, and Edge of Fate's melee changes kind of devastated the glaive stocks. However, shooting with glaives just hasn't really worked out. And I wanted to look into why and see if maybe the glaives are actually good. The majority of glaive builds in the history of Destiny have been glaive melee builds. I'm talking last season with Nobel, they went off very hard with Winterbite, and before then, people were using them with Synthos exclusively pretty much. However, glaives aren't just melee weapons. They're also guns and shields at the same time. The truly ideal build for a glaive has to incorporate weapon damage, melee damage, and the defensive block benefits. Most players don't have a problem with giving up some lethality for survivability, and your average glaive does competitive total damage. They're just unfortunately behind in raw DPS. This forces you to play slower to get the same value out of your ammo, and makes them thoroughly ineffective as DPS rotation options. In most cases, when you're using a special weapon, you have a primary to kill adds, and you want your special weapon to handle elites, majors, and mini-bosses or champion tier enemies. And they do backup damage for bosses as well. Either you dump your heavy and then use your special to make up the difference, or if you're doing a rotation that uses bait and switch or envious arsenal, you want to switch between them and you want your weapon to be doing as much damage as possible in as short a time as possible. Glaives fit really neither of those categories. All of the numbers I'm testing today are at 165 weapons at a 10 power practice range. When it comes to damage numbers, starting with adaptive glaives, these are our middle of the pack with 510 DPS and 16,665 total damage over the reserves. This total damage is comparable with aggressive snipers, who do have 15,840 total damage and 505 DPS over their reserves. Even still, with just a 1 mag DPS measuring how much damage you do before you have to reload, the blue aggressive sniper rifle will deal 1,375 damage per second, while your glaive will only deal 667 damage per second. Rapid fire glaives, on the other hand, deal 477 DPS and 12,704 total damage over their reserves, which is by far the worst deal you could possibly make, apparently. Finally, aggressive glaives deal 510 DPS with 18,975 total damage, outdamaging all the other options with the same DPS over their reserves. From these numbers, rapid-fire glaives are hot garbage and should be avoided at all costs. Aggressives are your best bet for higher damage for the same DPS, but adaptives are pretty fine. The main reason glaives feel so underwhelming in endgame is really the traits available to them, as the sniper we're comparing to would have a ton of amazing combos like Force Times Honing on Praedyths, or Envious Arsenal and Bait and Switch on Lance Ephemeral, which eliminates downtime on reloads and compounds their 1 mag DPS until they're capable of killing champions in a single stun. Glaives are practically incapable of removing a champion in a single stun, and are unable to maintain consistent uptime without reloading. Even if you use Envious Assassin to increase your capacity, the slow fire rate and low 1 mag DPS handicaps your potential DPS increases because the reload is hardly even slower than the fire rate. Something like Enhanced Surrounded would barely take the DPS over 1,000 in 1 mag, leaving you 30% behind a blue aggressive sniper rifle before it gets any perk. This isn't to say there's no hope for the weapon, but it is far from a burst option, especially when shooting champions. Perhaps then, the true threat of a glaive is its inevitability. Against an enemy who does not heal, they make you practically invincible, and even slow ammo refills like replenishing Aegis will allow you to keep the block raised. They are particularly good at dealing with Banes, Hive Guardians, and high threat elites in a safe but slow manner. Taking this into any content with a Void threat and a huge Ogre, you'll notice that this has some value. You could address this insufficiency by bringing a high burst heavy weapon or a grenade build, but the glaive itself does provide a possible solution with its 3-hit combo. While I don't think the melee should be and is not the end all be all for a glaive, an unbuffed 3-hit melee combo deals about 452 DPS, which is paltry, but hardly worse than shooting the weapon. As a side note, this number is against bosses versus champions. The melee combo starts at 752 DPS. At 200 melee, you would have 587 DPS. With a Spirit of Syntheseps class item that you can get on any class, you'll hit 1527 DPS. If you use a dedicated melee exotic for your class, you could go even further than this, but this at least shows even just a moderate investment can provide a huge burst of DPS the Glaive didn't have before. If you're playing in content where you have teammates who can re-stun enemies, distract them, or add extra damage, the Glaive is definitely not something to be scoffed at. 3 Glaives shooting an enemy will kill them in 1 stun, but specifically as a solo player or in a situation where you need to clutch up, your Glaive's not going to let you nuke a champion when you need to, unless you're building into this melee option as a backup and doing a hybrid combo, which the Glaive kind of wants you to do. So what are some situations and setups you may want to add a Glaive to? First off, double special loadouts with a good burst weapon immediately frees up the Glaive to focus on trash cleanup and survival. Bonus points if your build uses grenade or class ability spam. Second, anytime Glaives are anti-champion, they perform well. Rake Angle has Chill Clip, which means it can always provide anti-overload. Third, if you want to do a melee build, but you don't want to be tied to your cooldowns, the Glaives can be a nice middle step to either ramp up your buffs or take advantage of them while your cooldowns are cooling down. Fourth, if you're playing some kind of content without a DPS check, bringing a Glaive and moving well can basically guarantee you a clear. Finally, if any of the exotic Glaive effects seem useful to you, it's not a massive loss to include them to get a heal turret or a mini bubble, especially since they're guaranteed on hits. Making a build around Glaives as a melee and ranged weapon, you would want a high weapon and melee stat, and pair that with something like Syntheseps on any prismatic class, Winter's Guile on Warlocks, Frightened Vice on Hunters, or Worm Gods on Titans. Especially on Titan and Warlock, you can use the Glaive to build Worm God or Guile stacks without any cooldowns, and then benefit from the melee buffs, as well as gain the benefits to shooting with Triton Vice and Worm Gods, with Triton Vice providing explosions and Worm Gods providing weapon damage buff accordingly. As alternate options, if you want to focus on shooting the Glaive, consider weapon builds and things like Verities on all classes, Fortune's Favor on Hunters, Controverse or Getaway on Warlocks, and Precious Scars on Titan for some added survivability. When it comes down to what Glaive to use, I have several suggestions. First off, any of the exotic Glaives have their own unique benefits that make being a Glaive much less of a downside. For example, Vexcalibur provides its own melee damage buff as well as a higher DPS shooting option. Edge of Action provides a bubble, which is basically a mini Ward of Dawn, giving you overshields, extra damage, reload speed, and safer revives, and the healing turret on Edge of Intent. Then I would recommend Aggressive Frames as your main legendary archetype, followed by Adaptive Frames if you do not have an aggressive in your energy, and then avoid rapid fires at all costs. Rake Angle has some amazing perk combos, and Chill Clip is always going to be valuable. I do also want to shout out the Heron, which is coming out in the next Arms Week. This Void Aggressive Frame brings with it the recently buffed Redirection perk. This is going to reward you doing ad clear by giving you double damage against elites, mini-bosses, champions, and bosses for up to 15 shots. You can pair that with something like Replenishing Aegis or Envious Assassin, for probably what's going to be the strongest burst Glaive so far in the game. Even with all of this, its 1 mag DPS is not going to exceed a sniper rifle, shotgun, or even fusion rifle. However, it will be a lot closer and will at least help you clear out everything that's not a champion. Unfortunately for Glaives, they are just slightly inconvenient to use as they lock you out of your regular powered melee, which is what you want to be using when you're building into your melee stats so heavily with the Glaive, requiring you to juggle weapons if you want to use them effectively, or to fully commit to the Glaive without being a weapon that truly shines in DPS without building into melee, at which point you might sometimes be better off just using a regular melee build instead of the Glaive. As a defensive piece, it is a great option, but the new lightsaber, although being exotic, provides that same defensive benefit as a Glaive, which much more upfront DPS. So Glaives as an entire archetype are kind of falling behind the times, I think, and Bungie needs to really look at them as weapons, I think, and rework their DPS and their ammo economy probably to get them to be competitive DPS wise and less reliant on total reserves. They don't have to be comparable to shotguns and snipers, but they can't be less than half of what those are doing. Let me know down below what your current experiences are with Glaives, if you've used them since Edge of Fate, since Renegades. I really want to focus on the Glaives opportunity to be a weapon and a melee weapon at the same time. Thank you very much for joining me today, and I will see you all again very, very soon.